You're not supposed to be hearing this. What I'm about to tell you was sealed under lock and key for over a century. In the autumn of 1891, inside a dying coal town called Millerville, Pennsylvania, there was an opera house that had already begun to rot from the inside. The velvet curtains smelled of mildew, the brass fixtures tarnished green. The townspeople thought it was just another abandoned building from another failed dream. But beneath its stage, beneath the boards where polite society once applauded, something else was happening. Something no man was meant to witness. 17 bodies, chained in the dark, alive but declared dead by the state. Their death certificates signed, sealed, and filed away across 3 counties. This wasn't a horror novel. This was a ledger entry. You've probably heard the name Cornelius Vaneir whispered online or buried in the footnotes of circus history. But the truth about what he built, the Cabinet of Wonders, was never entertainment. It was a machine for turning human suffering into spectacle, and for laundering the souls of the forgotten into something profitable. And it worked because men with power let it work. The sheriff, the doctor, the papers. Imagine the smell of that basement. Rust, opium, sweat, and blood. Imagine waking up shackled to a damp wall, told you were dead, shown papers to prove it, and forced to perform acts so grotesque they burned your identity away. That's where our descent begins tonight, not with a ghost story, but with a map of power. Because what happened under the Millerville Opera House was not an accident. It was a template, a blueprint that still echoes now. I'm not telling you this to scare you. I'm telling you because every man who hears this story is forced to make a choice. To keep pretending or to finally open his eyes. This is your warning. Beyond this point, you can't unknow what you're about to hear. Beyond this point, history stops being a record and starts being a weapon. Ready? Millerville in 1891 was a town that had learned to look away. The mines had taken fathers. The mills had taken sons. And everyone understood that pain was part of the bargain. You didn't ask questions. When someone vanished, you prayed it wasn't your blood next. That's what Cornelius Vaneir counted on. He came dressed in civility. Top hat, gold cane, silver-tipped boots. He spoke softly with the kind of patience that made people want to please him. He said he was bringing wonder to the working class, something beautiful, something different. And Millerville, desperate for distraction, welcomed him. Behind the bright posters and painted wagons, though, was an acquisition network so organized it resembled an early form of corporate trafficking. Dr. Heinrich Kellerman, his partner, wasn't a doctor at all. He was a chemist, a forger, and an alchemist of human obedience. Together they built a pipeline of flesh. The orphans, the immigrants, the unfortunates. Those born with deformities were branded as miracles of God for the stage, while those too ordinary were reshaped chemically, surgically, psychologically until they became something that would sell. The townspeople knew something was wrong. They saw Kellerman's wagon arrive after midnight. They heard strange cries from beneath the opera house when the wind carried just right. But money buys silence, and guilt decays fast when it's fed. Sheriff Cromwell received envelopes thick with cash. The local reverend accepted donations for the poor from the same man who chained them underground. And every Sunday morning, the entire town sang hymns above the basement. Their voices floated over the trapped performers below, chained, drugged, half-starved, listening to the choir plead for salvation they would never receive. You see, the Cabinet of Wonders wasn't just a show. It was an experiment in control. How far could you bend the human mind before it forgot it was human? How many layers of illusion could you build before an entire town became complicit? Millerville wasn't corrupted overnight, it was seduced. Cornelius Vaneir didn't conquer the town with fear. He conquered it with gifts. Free tickets, free spectacles, free distraction from the crushing boredom of labor and loss. And that's how all control begins, not with chains, but with comfort. Once people crave what you provide, you don't need to imprison them. They'll guard the cage themselves. It began, as all fractures do, with a small crack. A single person who went missing that nobody wanted to miss. Her name was Clara Dawes, 21 years old, daughter of a coal foreman. She wasn't a performer, she wasn't poor, and she wasn't disposable. She had attended one of Vaneir's shows that spring. laughing from the front row as the strongmen bent iron and the serpent woman folded herself in half. A week later, Clara was gone. The sheriff claimed she'd run off with a minor. The local paper printed a one-line notice. No foul play suspected. But her mother swore she heard her daughter's voice at night. Faint, muffled, coming from beneath the opera house when the streets were quiet and the gas lamps hissed. The neighbors told her she was imagining things. The human mind, they said, plays tricks on grief. But grief doesn't hum through the floorboards. Vaneir held another performance 2 days later, and the townspeople came again. They came because curiosity outweighs conscience, and because the Cabinet of Wonders was the only beauty Millerville had left. That night, a new act appeared, a contortionist, veiled, with pale hair and a body that trembled like something newly broken. When she bent herself backwards until her face met the floor, the crowd gasped. Her mother fainted in the aisle, because beneath the stage light, through the veil, she saw Clara's eyes. No one spoke of it afterward. The sheriff escorted her out. The papers printed nothing. The next morning, the Dawes family's house was empty, their belongings gone, their neighbors silent. The entire street pretended it had always been abandoned. That's how the illusion began to splinter, not with rebellion, but with recognition. Someone finally saw the truth and was erased for it. And the crowd? They still came. They told themselves it couldn't have been Clara, that it was a trick of light, a shared delusion. Because the mind will do anything to protect the comfort of ignorance. That's how Vaneir thrived. He didn't just manipulate bodies, he rewired perception. He made people choose blindness over guilt. And once a society chooses that, you don't need to hide the horror anymore. You can put it right on stage. Thomas Fairchild was not a brave man. He was a newspaperman, which is to say, a man who sold truth for coins and comforted himself with the illusion that printing it mattered. In Millerville, the Weekly Gazette was little more than gossip and factory notices. But when Clara Dawes vanished, something inside him stirred, a rusted compass needle twitching toward something dangerous. The story didn't add up. The sheriff's report was sloppy, full of contradictions. The timeline made no sense. Fairchild requested access to town records and found something that should not have existed. Clara's death certificate. Signed, stamped, filed 2 days before she'd even disappeared. And not just hers. There were others, a miner from Scranton, a boy from Reading, an elderly widow from Allentown, all officially declared dead. All with signatures from the same physician, Dr. Hinrich Kellerman. Fairchild took the files home that night. He locked the door. He poured whiskey until his hands stopped shaking. The pattern was clear, but his rational mind rebelled. It couldn't be true that a man could, by the law, forge the dead and parade them alive before the same people who buried them. And yet, the signatures were there. Identical strokes of ink, identical dates. He tried to print the story. The next morning, his press was vandalized, the plates destroyed. A note pinned to his door read, "There are stories that feed the mind, and stories that eat it." But Fairchild's curiosity was stronger than his fear. He began watching the opera house from his office window, the comings and goings after midnight, the carriages without lights, the flicker of lamps below the stage even after the crowds had gone home. He started taking notes, drawing maps, marking names. What he didn't know was that the opera house was watching him back. Because Vaneir's control wasn't just local, it was systemic. He had bought the silence of officials in Harrisburg and Philadelphia, paid off coroners, and employed a network of record clerks who could erase a life with a single pen stroke. The Cabinet of Wonders didn't just distort human form. It distorted the paper trail of existence itself. Fairchild wasn't just chasing a murderer, he was trespassing into a machine built to rewrite reality. And once you start asking the wrong questions in a town like Millerville, you stop being a reporter and start becoming a missing person. For 3 nights, Thomas Fairchild watched from across the street, notebook trembling in his hand. The opera house was supposed to be empty, the season over. The Cabinet of Wonders moved on. But at 2:17 a.m., the lamps still burned beneath the stage. He could see them through the cracks in the cellar grates, faint, yellow, and shifting like fireflies under glass. Curiosity stopped being a choice. It became hunger. On the fourth night, he broke in. He told himself it was journalism, truth-seeking, but deep down he knew it was something else, a need to see. To confirm the darkness he already felt breathing under the town's polite silence. He entered through a side door, splintered the latch with a crowbar, and descended the narrow stairwell that smelled of wet iron and old medicine. The air thickened as he went deeper. The gaslight flickered over brick walls covered in strange markings, tally marks, symbols carved by hand. Not decoration. Counting. Pleading. The first chamber was small, low-ceilinged, lined with cages no larger than coffins. Inside, he found remnants. Broken shackles, scraps of costume, hair clumps matted with resin. And then, sound a whisper, faint, coming from farther down the corridor. He followed it until he reached a door reinforced with steel rods. When he pushed it open, the whisper became breath. 17 of them, huddled together in a vast circular room, chains bolted to the floor. Men, women, children, pale, skeletal, with painted faces that had not been washed away since their last show. Some stared through him. Others recoiled, afraid of the light. He tried to speak, but one woman, her spine twisted, her mouth trembling, pressed a finger to her lips. "He listens through the pipes," she whispered. "He hears when we remember." Fairchild looked closer and saw the tubes running through the ceiling, brass funnels leading upward toward the stage. They weren't just vents. They were microphones of an older kind, instruments of surveillance, feeding sound into Kellerman's laboratory above. Every cry, every confession, captured. It hit him then. These weren't performers. They were prototypes, experiments in obedience. Broken minds calibrated through pain and reward to obey rhythm, tone, command. And when one failed, when memory returned, the record books simply declared them dead. That's when the whisper changed. Not from them, but from the pipes above. A voice, smooth, measured, almost amused. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Fairchild." Fairchild turned toward the sound and saw him, Cornelius Vaneir, standing at the end of the corridor, as if the darkness itself had decided to take human form. The showman looked immaculate, even underground. Black coat pressed, silver buttons glinting against the lamplight. He wasn't angry. He looked almost pleased, as though Fairchild had finally arrived at an appointment long overdue. "Curiosity," Vaneir said, voice calm, cultured. "It's the oldest contagion. It killed more men than plague ever did." He stepped closer, the metal tip of his cane ringing against the floor. "Do you know what I sell, Mr. Fairchild? It isn't spectacle. It's order. I take the dissonant, the misshapen, the unwanted, and give them purpose. The audience sees deformity. I see design." Fairchild tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. The captives behind him watched with hollow eyes, waiting for something they already knew would not come. Vaneir continued. "The Cabinet of Wonders was born from a single question. What if chaos could be trained to entertain? What if fear itself could be choreographed? People pay for astonishment because astonishment reminds them they are still alive. And governments, churches, and newspapers, your kind, pay to keep them that way. But astonishment is a fragile thing. It needs sacrifice." He moved to one of the chained men, brushed his hand across the man's face like a priest giving benediction. "They volunteered once," he lied softly. "All of them. They wanted to matter. I simply helped them transcend limitation." Fairchild felt heat rise in his chest. "You turned them into slaves." Vaneir smiled. "No, Mr. Fairchild. The world above does that every day. I only removed the pretense." He gestured upward toward the ceiling pipes. "Every whisper you hear down here is only an echo of what lives in your factories, your offices, your churches. Chains of obedience, contracts of silence. You write their stories. I merely stage them." For a moment, Fairchild saw something in Vaneir's calm certainty that made moral outrage feel childish. This wasn't a lunatic. It was a philosopher who had replaced God with geometry and pain. "You came to expose me," Vaneir said, lowering his voice to a whisper. "But the truth, Mr. Fairchild, is that you came because you already suspect the world needs men like me. Order needs architects, even of horror. The match burned down to Vaneir's fingertips. He let it fall. Darkness swallowed them both. Fairchild ran. He didn't remember choosing Tohi's body, simply revolted against the weight of what he'd seen. He bolted up the stairwell, past the cracked wallpaper, past the velvet drapes that still smelled of grease paint and chloroform, until the night hit his lungs like cold iron. He stumbled into the alley behind the opera house. Retching, shaking, half convinced he'd been dreaming. But the world outside didn't care. Millerville was still breathing, still grinding through its routines. The lamps glowed. The saloon across the square was full. And the posters were already up for tomorrow night's show. He staggered toward the sheriff's office, clutching his notes. Cromwell sat behind his desk, polishing his revolver, expression unreadable. Fairchild spilled everything: the chains, the captives, the doctor, the basement. When he finished, there was a silence so long it felt rehearsed. Then the sheriff sighed, leaned back and said, "You shouldn't drink alone, Tom." Fairchild slammed his notes on the desk. But Cromwell didn't even look. He just gestured toward the door. Outside, 2 deputies were already waiting. They didn't arrest him. They escorted him. Gently, respectfully, like men guiding a drunk back home. That was the moment Fairchild understood. The entire town was inside the cabinet. Not chained below, but shackled above by debt, by fear, by comfort. The butcher supplied meat for the troop. The schoolteacher typed Vaneir's letters. The reverend blessed the tents before every tour. The corruption wasn't hidden. It had simply become normal. He tried the Gazette next. The printing press was gone. Every drawer emptied. His editor's seal missing. When he reached his boarding room, his papers were neatly stacked on his bed. The words, "Let it rest," scrawled across them in red ink. The town clock struck 3. Outside, the wagons were already lining up, the performers loading equipment under Kellerman's supervision. The cabinet was leaving for another city, another harvest of the forgotten, and the people of Millerville waved them off like heroes. Fairchild stood in the street, invisible among them, shouting words no one would hear. They smiled, clapped, turned away. That night, for the first time, he realized the truth Vaneir had tried to teach him in the dark. Control doesn't require chains. It only requires participation. And once a society decides to look away, evil doesn't need to hide. It takes center stage. He didn't sleep. For 2 days Fairchild rode the Pennsylvania rail line. The smell of coal and damp would mixing with the ghost of the basement. He kept seeing their faces, the 17, and hearing Vaneir's calm voice looping like a sermon. By the time he reached the next stop, a coal port called Durham Hollow, the Cabinet of Wonders was already erecting its tents beside the freight yard. From the hilltop he could see the whole ritual unfold with clockwork precision. The canvas rising like the ribs of a great animal, the colored banners flapping against gray sky, the crowds gathering even before dawn. He watched children tug at their mothers' sleeves, begging for tickets. The same melody drifted from the Calliope, tune too cheerful to be anything but cruel. That evening he slipped among them, hat pulled low, face hidden behind coal dust. The performances were flawless. Every act rehearsed to perfection. Every gesture soaked in that same eerie stillness he had seen underground. But there were new faces now, people who looked just a little too familiar. A miner he had met years ago in Millerville. A woman who'd been reported missing in Scranton. All of them smiling through painted masks. He tried to warn a local constable after the show. The man's reply chilled him. "We already know about Mr. Vaneir. He's a patron of progress. Helps the hospitals, the orphanage. Maybe you should thank him." The next morning, the constable was dead, found on the tracks. His pockets full of Fairchild's own notes. The headline in the Durham Gazette read, "Local drunk meets unfortunate end." That was when Fairchild understood he wasn't investigating anymore, was being erased. Each town the cabinet visited left behind the same trail. New prosperity, vanished poor, and records quietly rewritten. Wherever he sent letters, they returned unopened. The postal seals bore the same insignian eye inside a circle, stamped in black wax. Still, he kept following. He told himself it was duty, but deeper down it was obsession. He wanted proof that the world could still tell the difference between spectacle and sin. But the farther he went, the more he saw that the cabinet didn't need to hide. It was becoming a brand, an empire of wonder feeding on human amnesia. And somewhere in that growing darkness, Vaneir knew he was coming. By the winter of 1892, Fairchild had followed the cabinet across 4 counties, through snow and ruin, collecting scraps of evidence no one would print. Every new town looked the same: posters, laughter, vanishings, silence. But the money trail began to tell a different story. Payments moved not from ticket sales but from accounts linked to industrial syndicates in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. The cabinet wasn't a circus. It was a front. He traced the ledgers through a bank clerk who owed him a favor. The clerk's hands trembled as he revealed the names behind the signatures. Lawyers, railroad magnates, a senator's brother. Men who had invested in the cabinet as a psychological exhibition project. They weren't paying for entertainment, they were funding research. Fairchild went to Harrisburg to confront one of them, a financier named Walter Creel. The man received him in a parlor lined with portraits and cigar smoke. "Mr. Vaneir," Creel said calmly, "is an innovator. His cabinet is a laboratory of behavior. We study how the mind bends under pressure, how perception becomes devotion. In the new century, whoever controls perception will control the crowd." Fairchild felt his stomach twist. "You're experimenting on the poor." Creel only smiled. "We're shaping civilization. Someone must learn how to manage it." That night, Fairchild returned to his hotel to find his door ajar. His notes gone. His reflection staring back from a mirror etched with 3 words. "We found you." He fled into the streets as rain turned to sleet, every shadow behind him suddenly alive. The deeper he went, the clearer it became Vaneir wasn't a lone monster. He was an instrument. The Cabinet of Wonders had patrons in universities, factories, pulpits, and parliaments. Its true function was data, recording how much pain, fear, and awe could rewrite identity. It was the prototype of something far greater, an invisible architecture of influence that would outlive them all. Fairchild began mailing pieces of his evidence to trusted colleagues under aliases, scattering truth like seeds before the storm closed in. But one by one, the letters came back unopened, stamped "address not found." He started noticing the same faces in every town, watching from crowds, never applauding. Men in dark coats with the insignia of the eye within the circle. The financier's enforcers. Fairchild realized then that Vaneir had been telling the truth in that basement. The cabinet was not a show. It was a prototype for a system of control that would one day reach into every mind under the name of progress. For 3 months Fairchild lived as a fugitive, sleeping in freight cars and graveyards, his face gaunt, his voice worn to a whisper. Every headline he'd ever written had been replaced by lies. Local editor declared insane. Cabinet of Wonders vindicated. Fairchild missing after arson attempt. He carried only one thing now: a notebook, bound in cracked leather, filled with sketches of faces he'd seen vanish under the cabinet's tent. It was proof, or so he told himself, though he knew no one would ever believe it. Then came the night of the fire. He was in St. Lyle, a coal town already emptied by the cabinet's visit. The tents were gone, but the scent of burned oil still hung in the air. He broke into the abandoned opera house, looking for anything left behind, but what he found instead was a trap. A single light burned on stage. Beside it stood a man in a black coat, bowler tilted low. "Mr. Fairchild," he said, "you've made quite the journey." The next sound was the crack of a pistol butt against his skull. When he woke, the smell told him where he was before his eyes opened: oil, velvet, and iron. The cabinet, again, but deeper this time. The walls weren't stone anymore. They were glass, reflecting endless rows of faces, his own, multiplied and warped. Vaneir stood across from him, unmasked, hands clasped like a preacher before his congregation. "You've chased shadows long enough," he said. "Now you'll see the mechanism itself." Fairchild tried to speak, but his voice failed. Restraints bit into his wrists. He was seated inside a vast chamber wired with copper filaments and mirrors, each one focusing light on his reflection. Behind Vaneir, men in surgical aprons adjusted switches, recording dials. "You think you've uncovered our secret," Vaneir continued, "but you've only reached its threshold. The cabinet is not about spectacle or cruelty, it's about conversion. We measure belief. We study surrender. Every audience that watches us leaves altered, even if they don't know it. The same patterns you fear, Thomas, devotion, obedience, silence, they are the future of civilization. You will help us prove it." Fairchild struggled, shouting now. But the moment he did, the mirrors flickered not with his image, but with others. His childhood, his newsroom, his mother's face disapproving. Every memory reassembled and reflected back through distorted glass. "This is your initiation," Vaneir whispered. "The next phase requires more than fear. It requires recognition." The light grew brighter, drilling through his eyes, until he saw himself multiply, one Fairchild screaming, another writing, another bowing, another silent. Then came the voice, not Vaneir's, but his own, speaking words he did not remember saying. "Truth is a matter of consensus. You are part of the experiment now." The glass shattered inward, and the world went black. When Fairchild woke, there was no sense of beginning, only continuation. He didn't remember closing his eyes, or the moment light had vanished. He only knew that he was inside something, suspended between reflection and silence. The walls glowed faintly, pulsing with breath. Each pane of glass seemed alive, rippling with his own face, dozens of him, each one moving a fraction out of sync. When he lifted his hand, one reflection lagged, another smiled before he did. He whispered his name just to anchor himself, but the walls whispered back a dozen others. Thomas Fairchild. Thomas Vaneir. Thomas the witness. Thomas the subject. He staggered forward and met a mirror that yielded not like glass, but like water. The surface bent inward and drew him through. Suddenly, he was back in the newsroom. His typewriter clacked. Headlines scrolled across the page. "Cabinet of Wonders brings miracles to town." He shouted at his younger self to stop typing, but the younger Fairchild only turned, smiled, and said, "You wrote this. You always will." Then the scene collapsed, ink melting into light. The reflection reset. He was back in the chamber. Vaneir's voice filled the space, soft and measured. "Every truth has a counterimage, Thomas. You believe you write reality, but you only translate what we feed you. The cabinet's purpose is simple: to refine the human mind until it can no longer tell where the performance ends." Fairchild tried to focus on his breath, on the weight of his body, but even that began to slip. He remembered other versions of himself, the one who stayed in Millerville, the one who joined the cabinet willingly, the one who never existed at all. Each memory flashed like film reels spliced out of order. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. "Not obedience," said Vaneir. "Integration. The experiment requires a witness who can no longer tell the difference between observer and observed. You're perfect for that." The walls began to hum, their surfaces filling with light, each Fairchild speaking at once, their voices overlapping into one unbearable chord. Confessions, headlines, screams, prayers. He clawed at the glass, but it wasn't solid anymore. It was language, thought, memory looping infinitely around him. Somewhere beyond the hum, he heard Vaneir's last words before everything dissolved. "You see, Thomas, there is no truth without audience. And now you are both." The reflections smiled as one. And then stillness. The experiment had entered its next phase. They said the Cabinet of Wonders had changed that season, that something in the air felt different. The laughter no longer reached the rafters, and the performers' once grotesque curiosities now moved with a strange, haunted precision, as if someone else was puppeteering their minds from somewhere deep below the earth. The first to notice was a child in the front row. She whispered to her mother, "That man looks like the one from the newspaper." Her mother hushed her, but she was right. There, behind the singing angel and the serpent woman, stood a man, face pale, eyes distant, holding a cracked lantern. His name was never announced, but when the spotlight brushed across his features, several in the crowd gasped. It was Thomas Fairchild, or something that wore his memory. No one could explain it. Fairchild's articles had stopped appearing months ago, and rumors had spread that he'd gone mad or worse. But now, here he was, moving among the living exhibits like a ghost dressed for the stage. Some said his eyes followed only the children, as if trying to warn them. Others said he was simply part of the act, another illusion from the genius of Cornelius Vaneir. Yet, in every town the cabinet visited after that, the same phenomenon occurred. A man who looked exactly like Fairchild appeared in new acts, as the assistant to the bone serpent woman, as the shadow behind the Bavarian colossus, as the pianist in the background who never blinked. Each time, his presence grew more undeniable. He seemed to bleed through the boundaries of the performance, whispering words that weren't part of the script, glancing toward the audience with eyes that recognized them. And then the audience began to feel it too. The air would tighten, and a voice faint but intimate would murmur in the back of their minds. You are not watching. You are remembering. Some spectators left mid-show, trembling, unable to explain what they had seen. Others returned again and again, obsessed, drawn by something between fear and revelation. Vaneir didn't stop them. He encouraged it. For him, the cabinet was no longer a performance, it was infection. By the third month, the illusion had fully collapsed. Fairchild's reflection appeared in the mirrors of hotel rooms, in store windows, in photographs taken near the circus tents. He was everywhere and nowhere, a consciousness without anchor, multiplying like a living rumor. Those who met Vaneir backstage described him differently, now no longer flamboyant, but serene, as if he had accomplished what no scientist or priest had ever done, to merge witness and subject, man and myth. In his private notebook, later recovered by investigators, he wrote only one line beneath the date October 3, 1892. The experiment has breached containment. The audience is learning to dream in chorus. And from that night forward, every town the cabinet visited left behind the same trace, whispers of a voice in the dark that knew your name, and a flicker in the mirror that wasn't supposed to move when you did. By the summer of 1893, the Cabinet of Wonders was no longer a traveling show. It was a contagion, a moving fever that turned entire towns into stages. The crowds didn't gather to watch anymore. They gathered because they had to. People woke in the middle of the night, clutching their throats, whispering about lights that flickered behind their eyelids. Men abandoned their jobs at the mines. Women drifted through the streets, humming the melodies from the circus without realizing it. The performances had begun before the tents were even raised. When the cabinet finally arrived, the boundary between performer and spectator dissolved completely. The audience would sit in silence, waiting for the curtain to rise, but when it did, it wasn't the freaks or the acrobats they saw. It was themselves. Hundreds of mirrors positioned across the stage, bending light in impossible ways, reflecting the crowd back upon itself. They clapped, laughed, wept, unable to tell where the performance began or ended. Then the music changed. The air shimmered. People began to see shapes moving within the reflections, faces not their own. Expressions of agony and awe twisting together. Some screamed. Others reached out and touched the glass, swearing they could feel it breathing. The performers behind the mirrors moved in perfect synchrony with the spectators. Each motion mirrored back a fraction late, like a memory rehearsing its own existence. Witnesses would later report seeing Fairchild standing at the center of it all, holding that cracked lantern, speaking words that no one could remember but everyone claimed to understand. When he raised his hand, half the audience rose with him. When he wept, the crowd wept. When he whispered, "You're already inside," hundreds repeated it aloud without knowing why. Panic spread like fire through the tent. But it wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Every scream, every collapse, every convulsion followed rhythm, as though conducted by an invisible hand. The line between hypnosis and revelation vanished. And through it all, Vaneir watched from the shadows, his face unreadable, murmuring only, "They are ready." The aftermath was unspeakable. Entire families left the tent unable to recall their own names. Townsfolk wandered into the woods for days, believing themselves part of the act. Local priests reported parishioners confessing sins they hadn't committed, claiming the mirror men had shown them the truth. Newspapers tried to print stories, but the words came out wrong. Sentences rearranged themselves, headlines inverted, ink bled into symbols no one recognized. Every attempt to describe the event only deepened the distortion. It was as though reality itself was protecting the secret, rewriting every record that tried to expose it. And when the cabinet packed its tents and moved on, the towns didn't return to normal. Night after night, people still heard faint carnival music drifting through their walls. Some swore they could see lights flickering in mirrors long after midnight, shapes practicing their movements, waiting for the show to begin again. The line had been crossed. The cabinet was no longer a performance. It was a state of mind. And every man who had watched, even for a moment, was now part of it, a performer in a story that could never end. The Cabinet of Wonders didn't vanish. It evolved. The shadows of Millerville, Durham Hollow, and St. Lyle stretched far beyond their 19th century roots, seeping into the modern world like a virus that had learned to speak in binary. Fairchild's fragmented consciousness now, a ghost tethered to the experiment, became embedded in recordings, newsreels, and grainy photographs that no one could verify. Every image of a crowd, every viral clip of a spectacle, carries a trace of him, a witness and a warning most cannot comprehend. Corporations, governments, and media conglomerates began to function like the cabinet itself, designing attention, choreographing reactions, testing obedience. Social media algorithms became the new mirrors. Curated feeds reflected the desires and fears of the audience back to itself, just as the mirrored stage once did. Reality, filtered through lens and screen, became a controlled experiment. And those who noticed, the ones with sharp eyes and restless minds, felt the echo of Fairchild's warning. You are no longer a spectator. You are the observed. Psychological studies of mass behavior, viral marketing campaigns, and the architecture of social control all followed the same blueprint Vaneir perfected. Enlistment in belief, compulsion to participate, the slow bending of perception, these were not anomalies. They were codified techniques, perfected over a century, applied with precision through light, sound, and suggestion. You watch, you click, you scroll, thinking you choose, while the patterns of thought, fear, and desire are measured, recorded, and folded back into the machine. And Fairchild's own mind remained a thread in the system, bleeding through every iteration of the cabinet's influence. Every viral video of a staged wonder, every manipulated headline, every curated narrative carries a shadow of him, a witness forever trapped inside the architecture of control he tried to expose. Some nights, when the lights are low and your notifications fall silent, you might glimpse it. A reflection not your own, a shape out of sync, a memory that isn't yours. It is the cabinet reaching out, a signal buried in code, reminding you that the experiment never ended. It simply adapted. And now it is everywhere. Not under a tent, not in a basement, but in the devices in your hands, the systems you rely on, the invisible architecture of attention itself. The methods are older than the technology. Recruitment, conditioning, manipulation, compulsion. Only the tools have changed. The line between free will and performance is thinner than ever. The spectators of the 1890s have multiplied, connected, algorithmically aligned. And the ghost of Thomas Fairchild whispers across the network. Look closely. You are part of the story now. You've followed the cabinet from its birth in a Pennsylvania basement to its rebirth in the screens glowing before you now. You've watched the freak show peel back into an experiment, and the experiment peel back into a doctrine. You've felt it stalking you, moving closer with every section, every word. Now it's no longer a story about Cornelius Vaneir or Thomas Fairchild, or even the people chained in the dark. It's about you. The doctrine was never hidden behind a curtain. It was hidden in your habits. It isn't a circus or a conspiracy or an algorithm, it's the structure of attention, the soft scaffolding of thought. Vaneir didn't build it. He only recognized it. Fairchild didn't escape it. He only became aware of it. And you, sitting there now, are the audience and the stage, the performer and the observer, the cage and the key. That is the final seal. The experiment's aim was never to keep 17 people chained in a basement. It was to learn how to keep millions chained in their own reflections, to teach people to participate willingly in their own containment. The Cabinet of Wonders was just a prototype. The real cabinet is the world you live in. Look around you now. The mirrors aren't glass anymore. They're timelines, feeds, headlines, crowds, rituals, screens. Every time you look, it looks back. Every time you click, it learns. You've been walking through its corridors your entire life, rehearsing the role without ever reading the script. If you felt the hair rise on your neck during this descent, that's not just fear. It's recognition. The pattern you've sensed is the one you're already inside. The ghosts in the mirrors aren't Fairchild. They're the unchosen versions of you, the lives you never lived, the choices you didn't make, rehearsing themselves forever just behind the glass. That's why I'm asking you now directly. If you've made it this far, type in the comments twice this phrase, "I see through the mirrors." It locks in your awareness, and it tells the others who have also made it through. Together, you're no longer just an audience. You're witnesses, because the cabinet doesn't end when the video stops. It waits, it adapts, it follows, and the moment you recognize it, you've already begun to step out of your assigned role. You can close the tab, turn off the light, walk away. But you'll still feel it, that pulse, that breath, that faint carnival music humming under the noise of your day. Not a curse, not a conspiracy, just the quiet truth the freak show tried to hide. You were never just watching. You were always inside. And now the choice is yours. If this story chilled you or opened your eyes to hidden patterns in our world, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. Comment, "I see through the mirrors" twice to claim your place as a witness. Share this video with someone who thinks they can handle the truth. The cabinet isn't just history. It's inside all of us.